In 1874, a column of U.S. cavalry spent weeks chasing Comanche bands across the Texas Panhandle. The soldiers wore summer uniforms. The temperature was dropping. A norther was blowing in, and these men from eastern forts had no idea how to stay warm on the open Llano Estacado, where the wind rips across flat grassland with nothing to stop it for hundreds of miles. The Comanche they were chasing? They'd been sleeping through nights like this for generations, not huddled and miserable, not barely hanging on, sleeping through them in conditions comfortable enough to wake rested and ride at dawn. So how did a people with no insulated buildings, no furnaces, and no synthetic gear survive winters that killed equipped soldiers? The answer wasn't toughness. Every culture on the plains was tough. Toughness alone doesn't keep your blood warm at 2 in the morning when the ground is frozen solid and the wind is pulling heat out of your body faster than you can make it. The answer was a system, built from 6 interlocking layers, each one solving a specific problem that the cold creates. And when the U.S. Army finally figured that out, they didn't try to copy the system. They burned it to the ground. The Comanche controlled a territory so vast it had its own name, Comancheria. It stretched roughly 240,000 square miles across the southern Great Plains, covering parts of what is now Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and deep into Texas. The Ute word that gave them their name roughly translates to anyone who wants to fight me all the time. And that reputation was earned. They were, by most historical accounts, among the most effective mounted warriors on the continent. But fighting wasn't their only skill. Surviving was. The southern Great Plains look flat and exposed, and most of the landscape is exactly that. In winter, Arctic air pours down from Canada and races across the grassland with almost no resistance. Wind chill on the Llano Estacado, the vast high plateau of the Texas Panhandle, can make already freezing temperatures feel far worse. Early settlers and soldiers routinely suffered frostbite, hypothermia, and death trying to survive winter nights in this country. The Comanche had solved this problem centuries before any of those settlers arrived. And the solution started with where they chose to sleep. Every autumn, as the buffalo herds shifted and the cold set in, Comanche bands moved off the exposed high plains and into the canyons that cut through the Caprock Escarpment. Palo Duro Canyon, the second largest canyon on the North American continent, was one of the most important of these winter refuges. Its walls drop roughly 700 feet below the level of the surrounding plains. Down at the canyon floor, water runs through creek beds, timber grows along the banks, and the sheer rock walls block the worst of the wind. Blanco Canyon, farther east near present-day Lubbock, served the same purpose. It was a broad, shallow valley stretching roughly 30 miles long and averaging about 1,500 feet in width, cut by smaller side canyons that created natural hiding places. The Quahati Comanche, the most independent and warlike of the Comanche bands, favored it as a campground for years. When Colonel Ranald Mackenzie first encountered it during a campaign in 1871, his own men struggled through the steep terrain, dense brush, and arroyos just to reach the canyon floor. One officer described trials and tribulations and much hard talk verging on profanity as his soldiers got lost in a dead-end side canyon and had to wait until daybreak to find their way out. The Comanche knew every trail in and out. They'd been navigating these canyons since they first migrated south from the Wind River region of present-day Wyoming, sometime in the early 1700s. This wasn't random. The Comanche selected winter camp locations the way a modern engineer selects a building site. The canyon walls provided a windbreak. The lower elevation meant warmer temperatures than the exposed plateau above. Timber along the creek beds supplied firewood, and the narrow entry points made the camps defensible against both enemies and weather. In winter, the bands arranged their tipis in rows along the sheltered canyon floors, close to water and fuel. In summer, when they followed the buffalo herds out onto the open plains, they arranged camps in circles. The seasonal shift in camp layout wasn't cultural decoration. It was a functional response to different environmental pressures. But location was only the first layer. The shelter itself was the second. The Comanche tipi was not a primitive tent. It was a carefully engineered portable structure that had been refined over centuries of plains living. The Comanche used a 4-pole foundation system, different from the 3-pole systems used by tribes like the Sioux and Cheyenne. Typically, a teepee required 15 to 25 poles, each one 20 to 30 feet long, made from straight, slender lodgepole pine or red cedar. The cover was built from tanned buffalo hides, with a standard teepee needing 13 to 16 hides stitched together. 2 design features made the teepee effective in winter. First, the smoke flaps. The opening at the top of the teepee and the adjustable flaps on either side allowed the occupants to build a fire inside the shelter for cooking and warmth while venting smoke upward and out. This sounds simple, but most enclosed shelters throughout history have struggled with exactly this problem. Build a fire inside a sealed space and you suffocate. Build it outside and you freeze. The teepee solved both. Second, the inner lining. In winter, a secondary layer of hide or canvas was hung inside the teepee, creating a gap between the outer wall and the interior space. This dead air space acted as insulation, the same principle used in double-pane windows thousands of years later. When temperatures dropped further, the Comanche stuffed dried grass into that gap, adding even more insulating material. The lining also directed cold drafts upward and away from the people sleeping on the ground, while fresh air for the fire could be ducted underneath. The result was a shelter that could be heated with a small interior fire, retained warmth effectively, ventilated smoke without killing the occupants, and could be taken apart, packed onto a horse-pulled travois, and reassembled at the next camp in under an hour. The cone shape made it stable in high winds and strong under heavy snowfall. It withstood conditions that collapsed the canvas tents issued to U.S. Army soldiers. The Comanche leader Quanah Parker once said, "The white man goes into his church and talks about Jesus. The Indian goes into his teepee and talks with Jesus." The teepee wasn't just shelter. It was a home, a spiritual space, and a piece of technology that had been iterated on for over 400 years of plains living. And the person responsible for all of this? Comanche women. They owned the teepees. They built them, maintained them, transported them, and decided when and where they went up. A skilled woman could disassemble a full teepee, pack the hides and poles onto a horse-pulled travois, move to a new camp, and reassemble the entire structure in a remarkably short time. The poles themselves served double duty, forming the frame of the travois when the camp was on the move, and the skeleton of the teepee when it was time to stop. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was single purpose. The engineering knowledge passed from mother to daughter across generations, and it was as critical to Comanche survival as any warrior's skill with a bow. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. Now, even the best insulated shelter needs bedding when the temperature outside drops below freezing. And on the southern plains, winter nights can get brutally cold. The Comanche answer to this was the buffalo robe. A buffalo robe is not the same as a buffalo hide. The distinction matters. Hides taken in summer, when the animal's coat is thin, were used for teepee covers, moccasins, and clothing. They had relatively little value in the cold. Robes, on the other hand, were specifically taken during the winter months, between November and March, when the bison's fur was at its thickest and most dense. Buffalo fur has a quality that makes it exceptionally good at trapping warmth. The individual hairs are hollow. That hollow core traps air, and trapped air is one of the best natural insulators that exists. The same principle is what makes down feathers effective in modern sleeping bags and winter jackets. A single buffalo robe wrapped around a person sleeping on the ground inside an insulated teepee, next to a low fire, created a personal heat envelope that could handle temperatures well below freezing. The Comanche didn't just use one robe, either. They layered them. Robes beneath the body to insulate against the frozen ground. Robes over the body to trap rising heat. In extreme cold, multiple layers turned a simple bed into something closer to what we'd recognize today as a sleeping system. And because a single robe weighed far less than the equivalent in woven blankets, they were practical for a people who moved camp regularly. Tanning and preparing these robes was another skill held primarily by Comanche women, and it was demanding. physical work that could take days per hide. The process involved scraping, stretching, softening, and treating the hide until it was supple enough to wrap around a sleeping body without cracking in the cold. The quality of the finished robe depended entirely on the skill of the person who processed it. A well-tanned robe stayed soft and flexible even in the bitterest freeze. A poorly processed one stiffened, cracked, and lost its insulating value. Buffalo robes were so effective as insulation that European traders and settlers recognized their value immediately. Robes became one of the most important trade goods on the southern plains, and the commercial demand for them eventually contributed to the mass slaughter of the bison herds. The robes that kept the Comanche warm in winter were the same robes that fur traders shipped east to Montreal, New York, St. Paul, and St. Louis, where they were used as blankets, carriage padding, and heavy winter coats. The trade was so aggressive that it became a major factor in pushing the buffalo toward near extinction by the late 1870s. But even with canyon shelter, an insulated teepee, and buffalo robes, the coldest nights demanded more. And this is where the Comanche used a technique that sounds almost too simple to work: heated stones. Before sleeping, rocks were placed directly in the campfire and allowed to absorb heat for hours. Once hot enough, they were pulled from the fire, wrapped in leather to prevent burns, and tucked into the bedding. The stones radiated warmth slowly through the night, acting as personal heaters long after the fire itself had burned low. Some accounts describe water being poured over heated stones inside the teepee, creating a burst of steam that raised the interior temperature and added moisture to air that winter cold had dried out. This technique was used across many plains tribes, not just the Comanche, and it wasn't limited to sleeping. Sweat lodges used the same principle, heating stones to extreme temperatures and pouring water over them in enclosed spaces for both spiritual practice and physical cleansing. The Comanche understood heat transfer at an intuitive, practical level, even if they never wrote equations about it. Think about what this means in practical terms. You've got a family bedded down inside a buffalo hide teepee, protected from the wind by 700 feet of canyon wall, wrapped in robes made from winter bison fur. And now they've got heated stones radiating warmth directly into their bedding. Each layer stacks on the last. None of them alone would be enough. Together, they turned a freezing night into something survivable, and often comfortable. There was also the fire management itself. At night, the campfire inside the teepee would burn down to coals. Rather than letting it die completely, the Comanche covered the remaining coals with ash and dirt. This insulated the embers and kept them alive through the night, so that in the morning, relighting the fire was as simple as uncovering the coals and adding fuel. On a frozen morning when your hands are stiff and your kindling is damp with frost, having a pre-lit coal bed is the difference between a fire in 2 minutes and a fire in 30. The dried fuel the Comanche burned in these fires tells its own story. On the open plains, trees are scarce. You can ride for miles without seeing anything taller than grass. So, the Comanche, like other plains tribes, burned dried buffalo dung called chips. Buffalo chips burn hot, burn long, and are available anywhere the herds grazed, which was essentially everywhere on the southern plains. The abundance of this fuel source meant that even in the most exposed winter camps, fire was always an option. Now, all of these external systems, the canyon, the teepee, the robes, the heated stones, would still fall short without one more critical piece. And it's the one that people almost never think about when they picture survival in freezing conditions: diet. The Comanche ate a diet built around buffalo meat, and specifically around foods that were extremely high in fat. Their staple preserved food was pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried, shredded buffalo meat and rendered animal fat, sometimes mixed with crushed berries or nuts. The word itself comes from the Cree language, where Pemmican derives from the word for fat or grease. Pemmican is one of the most calorie-dense foods ever developed by any culture. Roughly 450 calories per 100 grams, with about 35 grams of protein and 30 grams of fat in each serving. And that fat content is the key to understanding how it helped the Comanche survive freezing nights. When your body digests fat, the metabolic process generates heat. It's called Diet-induced thermogenesis. Fat takes longer to break down than carbohydrates, which means the heat production is sustained over hours rather than spiking and crashing. Eating a high-fat meal before sleeping in cold conditions is, in metabolic terms, like banking fuel for a slow-burning furnace inside your own body. Modern Arctic survival research has confirmed this. A study on subjects living outdoors in severely cold conditions found that a daily intake of pemmican provided adequate performance for survival, precisely because of the sustained energy release from the fat content. The berries sometimes added to pemmican weren't just for flavor either. They provided vitamin C, which helped prevent scurvy during long winters when fresh plant food was scarce. French fur traders and early Arctic explorers who adopted pemmican from indigenous peoples found they could survive for months eating almost nothing else. That kind of nutritional completeness wasn't an accident. It was the result of centuries of refinement by people whose lives depended on getting the recipe right. The Comanche also ate buffalo marrow mixed with mesquite beans, another high-fat, high-calorie food. And fresh buffalo meat, cooked over open flame or dried as jerky for travel, was the daily staple whenever the herds were accessible. This wasn't a diet chosen for pleasure. It was a diet shaped by the reality that on the southern Great Plains in January, your body needs dense fuel to maintain core temperature through a 12-hour night. And then there were the horses. The Comanche relationship with horses went beyond anything the U.S. Army or European settlers had ever encountered. They acquired their first horses from Pueblo Indians after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Within a generation, they had built an entire culture around them. Boys learned to ride before the age of 6. By the time they were warriors, they could hang off the side of a galloping horse, using it as a shield while firing arrows from under its neck. The artist George Catlin, one of the first Europeans to document Comanche life, wrote that a Comanche on foot was awkward and slow, but the moment he touched his horse, he became a different being entirely. Horses were wealth. A person's herd size reflected their social standing in the community. The Comanche didn't just ride horses. They bred them, trained them for specific functions like hunting, racing, and combat, and built an economic system around trading them that stretched from the northern plains all the way south into Mexico. Their herds were enormous. A single band might control hundreds or even thousands of animals. Horses were transportation, enabling the Comanche to follow buffalo herds across hundreds of miles of open country. And horses were military assets. An Englishman named William Blakemore, who spent 8 years living with the tribe, described them as on foot slow and awkward, but on horseback graceful, the most expert and daring riders in the world. The U.S. cavalry, which considered itself a mounted fighting force, was consistently outmaneuvered by Comanche warriors who could fire arrows at full gallop while hanging off the side of their horse, using the animal's body as a shield. The cavalry even tried stealing Comanche-trained horses, thinking the animals were the advantage. They weren't. The bond between rider and horse was the advantage, and it couldn't be stolen. And horses were warmth. Rival Plains tribes told stories about the Comanche bringing their favorite horses directly into the teepee at night. This wasn't sentimentality. A horse generates a significant amount of body heat. In a teepee designed to retain warmth, the presence of a large animal radiating heat through the night made a real, measurable difference to the interior temperature. The Comanche valued their best horses so highly that some accounts describe them prioritizing the horse's shelter over their own family members during severe weather. Every layer of this system reinforced the others. The canyon blocked the wind so the teepee could retain heat. The teepee's lining and smoke flaps created a controllable interior climate. The buffalo robes trapped body heat against the sleeper. The heated stones added radiant warmth through the night. The high-fat diet fueled the body's own heat production from the inside. And the horses, kept close, contributed their body heat to the shared space. It wasn't one trick, it was a system. Remove one layer and the others still keep you alive. Remove 2 and you're in trouble. Remove all of them at once and you're dead before sunrise. That redundancy is what made the Comanche winter camp so resilient. A bad storm might wet your firewood, but you still have your robes and your heated stones and the canyon wall blocking the worst wind. A shortage of buffalo hides might mean thinner teepee walls, but your high-fat diet and your horse's body heat fill the gap. Every layer compensated for the weaknesses of the others. And it worked so well that the Comanche thrived in conditions that routinely killed the Europeans and Americans who entered their territory. The U.S. Army eventually figured this out, and when they did, they didn't try to match the system. They decided to destroy it. On the morning of September 28, 1874, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie of the 4th U.S. Cavalry reached the rim of Palo Duro Canyon with roughly 400 soldiers. Below him, 700 feet down on the canyon floor, sat the winter camps of Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne bands. They had been gathering there since late summer, stockpiling food and supplies for the coming cold season, just as their ancestors had done for generations. Mackenzie's Tonkawa scouts found a narrow trail down the canyon wall. The soldiers descended single file in the pre-dawn darkness. By the time the sun came up, they were on the canyon floor. A Kiowa shaman named Mackenzie had promised the gathered bands that they would be safe in the canyon. The steep walls, the narrow access points, the sheer difficulty of the terrain, all of it had protected them before. For generations, Palo Duro had been a sanctuary. The attack was designed as a surprise, and it largely succeeded. A Comanche leader named Red Warbanet spotted the soldiers just before the assault, but there wasn't enough time to mount a coordinated defense. Indian leaders Iron Shirt of the Cheyenne, Poor Buffalo of the Comanche, and Lone Wolf of the Kiowa could not organize a united response. The bands scattered, abandoning their camps and fleeing up the canyon's side walls and onto the plains above. The battle itself produced relatively few casualties. Mackenzie's forces reported only one soldier wounded. What Mackenzie did after the fighting was what broke the Comanche. He burned everything: the teepees, the stored food, the buffalo robes, the pemmican, the dried meat, all of the winter supplies that the bands had spent months accumulating, every layer of the survival system that had kept them alive through countless winters before this one, gone in a single morning. Then he dealt with the horses. His soldiers captured over 1,000 ponies from the camp. Mackenzie knew that if the Comanche recovered those horses, they would simply rebuild and disappear into the plains again. So he ordered the horses slaughtered. Over 1,000 animals, killed in a canyon that the Comanche had used as a winter refuge for generations. Without shelter, without food, without horses, and with winter approaching, the Comanche bands that had fled Palo Duro could not hold out. Most returned to the Fort Sill Reservation by November of that year. The last holdouts surrendered by February of 1875. The Battle of Palo Duro Canyon was the last major engagement of the Red River War, and it marked the end of the Southern Plains Indians' military resistance. Mackenzie didn't defeat the Comanche in combat. He defeated their winter survival system. That distinction matters because it tells you exactly how effective that system was. The U.S. Army, with its supply lines and forts and industrial manufacturing, looked at the Comanche's ability to survive the Southern Plains winter and concluded that the only way to win was to make sure the Comanche couldn't use it anymore. The system the Comanche built to sleep through freezing nights wasn't a collection of random survival hacks. It was knowledge accumulated across generations, tested against some of the harshest conditions on the continent, and refined until every component worked together. Canyon walls that blocked the wind, Tipi engineering that created controllable shelter, buffalo robes whose hollow core fibers trapped body heat, heated stones that radiated warmth through the night, a diet dense enough in fat to fuel the body's own furnace for 12 hours of sleep, and horses, valued above almost everything else, kept close enough to share their warmth. Most of it was destroyed in a single morning in 1874. The teepees, the robes, the pemmican stores, the horse herds, all gone. The physical infrastructure of a winter survival system that had taken centuries to perfect, reduced to smoke and ash on a canyon floor in the Texas Panhandle. But the knowledge of how it worked survived. The Comanche Nation endures today, headquartered in Lawton, Oklahoma, and the understanding of what their ancestors built on those canyon floors has outlasted every army that tried to erase it. Modern survival instructors study indigenous cold weather techniques. Outdoor researchers test buffalo-robe insulation and pemmican nutrition. The principles the Comanche used, windbreak placement, dead air insulation, radiant heat storage, high-fat metabolic fueling, are now taught in wilderness survival courses around the world, often without acknowledging where they came from. The next time you see a sleeping bag rated to 20 below, or a freeze-dried meal packet designed for Arctic conditions, or a tent engineered to withstand high winds, you're looking at modern versions of problems the Comanche solved with buffalo hides, canyon walls, and animal fat. They didn't have laboratories or research grants. They had observation, iteration, and the understanding that if your system fails on a January night on the Llano Estacado, you don't get a second chance to fix it. Surviving the cold was never about being tougher than the weather. It was about being smarter than it.